All right, so let's take a look at an example that is a little bit closer to what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, where we have been creating components that go out to a server, go fetch an array of users, an array of providers, an array of whatever, right? And then it renders it on a component in React, either as a list or a table or whatnot, right? So let's look at something that's a little more familiar to us. So for instance, here's a trivial component that is given as input a collection of users, and then it uses that collection of users to iterate and then generate line items for every single user and just display the username for each one of those users. Yes, this is something you perhaps might have built for one of the assignments that renders lists of either services, providers, frequently asked questions, and whatnot. All right. The only thing to point out here is that this is using a technique in React, which I don't remember if we covered it. This is a stateless component, right? Stateless is that, notice that internally doesn't have a constructor. It's not initializing any state, right? That it's completely and wholly dependent on the arguments that are being passed into this function. You see that? It also notice that it's being implemented as a pure function. Right, so this is an ES6 function, right? The function is called users. It takes as argument a users array here, and then it returns a DOM object, right? That has been dynamically rendered. Make sense, right? So the fact that this is a function, it makes it ideal for testing, right? That the fact that it doesn't have a constructor, the fact that it doesn't have any state. Right? It makes it ideal as a unit testable component, right? Because as a function, whatever inputs you give it, it's always going to come back with the same identical responses, right? For input 1, it'll give you output 1, right? For input 2, it'll give you output 2, and it'll always be the same output for the same input, right? And that makes it so much easier to test, right? If this component would be stateful, then it would complicate matters, right? Because you would because you would have maybe a whole bunch of, it would remember things, and the component might be in 2, 3, 4 different possible states, and to test everything correctly, you would have to provide a sequence of inputs that would put the component in that particular state. Yes, so that would make it so much more complicated to test. When it's a functional component such as this, it simplifies testing very, very much. That's why React became very popular as a framework, as a front end framework, because it encourages implementing front end components as uniquely functional components. Right. Obviously, there's always going to be some state, but this will allow you to separate those components that are stateful, that need special testing, and those components that are entirely stateless, right? And typically in React, we encourage implementing as much as stateless as possible, again, to facilitate testing, right? To make it so much easier. So anyway, so this users wholly depends on data being passed in as an argument. In this particular case, the data is being passed from this wrapper application that is stateful, right? And that it's loading the users perhaps from a service here, from a singleton service, and going out to the server to retrieve all the users, and then changing its state, and then those users using it to render a users passed in as a property. Yes, this is how you would look at it when you render it on the screen. Yes, but to test it, what you want to do is test users independently, regardless on where it's being rendered, right, and displayed. You want to be able to test it all by itself, right? So, for instance, one of the ways that you could do this is to use the React test renderer that we used earlier, right? Again, no browser whatsoever. We load the component that is under test. In this particular case, is the users component, right? And that users component, we're going to use it to render it, to see how it renders when we give it a known input. Right? So for instance, here we are hard-coding that input. We're hard-coding that input and saying that we're going to give you this particular input that I know I'm giving you Alice and Bob. And what I'm going to expect is that there will be one UL that contains two LIs, right, that contains the values of Alice and Bob. Yes? Right? And we're going to create a snapshot and make sure that you are indeed rendering what I expect. If I give you this input, this known input, I want to make sure that you render this particular DOM element. Yes? And hopefully that would give me some level of confidence that if I use the same component live with real data, that it will too behave correctly. Yes, because I've tested it with several known pieces of data, perhaps exercising various edge cases, maybe with usernames that are extremely long, or maybe usernames that are null, usernames are empty strings. Usernames are whatever, right? That exercise the DOM in such a way that tests whether it's responsive or the layout is correct and it's handling all these things correctly, right? Or maybe I test it with an empty array, or I don't pass anything, or whatever. The component internally should be able to handle all these things, right? If it's empty, maybe it should display a label saying that I'm empty, right? Or that if it's too long, right, that if it's too many pieces of array, it adds maybe a pagination component or something like that, or whatever. Yes? So this would allow me to isolate, right, the component all by itself without relying on having the actual entire infrastructure loading this one component. It allows me to simulate the input that I'm passing into the component. Right? So here we're generating the snapshot. Right? And the first time around, there's nothing to compare against, so I'll generate a brand new file. The name of the file will be based on the user.test, so it'll be a snap file. Here it is, the snapshot. And so this is the DOM that it generates: UL, LI with Alice and LI with Bob. And this would then be used the baseline of my my DOM element. So that if I change my implementation, if I change this, the way I iterate over this, or I inadvertently, change UL to OL, for instance, yes, or I change it to table or whatever, right? This will render differently. It'll be compared against the snapshot, and it'll report it as a defect, and then it says, "Ooh, what did I do?" Right? And maybe I missed something. I mistakenly. I mistyped something here, or I'm missing something there. It'll report it as a defect, right? So that's the intent of tests, right? The intent of tests is to identify one particular point in time where we know the application is behaving correctly, and we would like the help of the test to identify any deviations, right, from when applications used to work correctly. And identify any input, anything that I might have included that might have broken it somehow. Okay. So here we're using users as a hard-coded array, or we could also use our user service. Notice that we didn't use the user service at all, right? But here I'm just illustrating the fact that we can also test with live data, right? Not that you would do this, but here is just an example on. Going out to a service, this is actually generating an HTTP request going out to a server. The server is going out to a database. The database is coming back, right? And here's the promise that comes back, and using the users array that comes back to then render the users and then create the snapshot out of it. Not that you would do this, but just illustrating how you would go about it, right? To integrate. This would be great for like an integration testing, right? For integration testing, where you want to test the entire stack. Right, where you can start from the front end, all the way to the web service, all the way to the database, see as it comes back.